Can I play for food? The weathered voice of the 42-year-old man cut through the refined atmosphere of the Metropolitan Arts Center like an alarm bell through the silence of night. The elegant conversations in the marble lobby came to an abrupt halt as hundreds of pairs of eyes turned toward the source of this audacious interruption. There, standing at the entrance to the grand ballroom, was Captain Marcus Thompson of the San Francisco Fire Department, his soot-stained uniform bearing witness to the warehouse fire he had battled just 3 hours earlier. His broad shoulders carried the weight of 22 years of service, 22 years of running toward danger when others ran away. The reflective stripes on his dark blue uniform caught the light from the crystal chandeliers above, creating brief flashes that seemed to mock the glittering jewelry adorning the necks and wrists of San Francisco's cultural elite. In his calloused hands, he clutched his red helmet, the scratches and dents on its surface telling stories of countless rescues, of lives saved and tragedies witnessed. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Around him swirled a sea of designer evening gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos, each outfit worth more than Marcus made in several months of risking his life for the city's citizens. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the musical clink of champagne glasses, but now it carried something else entirely, the acrid smell of smoke that clung to Marcus's uniform like a badge of honor that these privileged guests found deeply offensive. "How in God's name did that man get past security?" hissed Councilwoman Patricia Whitmore, her champagne flute trembling in her manicured grip. Her voice carried the particular brand of outrage reserved for those who believe their wealth should protect them from encountering life's harsher realities. "This is supposed to be an exclusive event. The smell is absolutely revolting." "Someone should call security immediately," agreed businessman Richard Pemberton, adjusting his gold-plated cufflinks with nervous energy. "We pay premium prices to avoid exactly this sort of intrusion." The irony of the situation was almost poetic in its cruelty. This gala, hosted in the Metropolitan Arts Center's most opulent ballroom, was ostensibly dedicated to raising funds for music education programs in underserved communities. The evening's program, printed on thick cream-colored cardstock and distributed to each guest upon arrival, spoke eloquently about bridging cultural divides and ensuring that the transformative power of classical music reaches every corner of our diverse city. Yet here stood a member of that very working class, being treated like an unwelcome pest by the same people who claimed to champion his cause. Marcus had learned about this event through a combination of chance and determination. During his lunch break at Station 19, while the rest of his crew dozed or watched television, he had been listening to KDFC, the city's classical music station. Between movements of a Beethoven symphony, the announcer had mentioned the gala, describing it as San Francisco's premier fundraising event for music education accessibility. Something in those words had stirred something deep within Marcus's chest. A longing that had been buried under 2 decades of duty and sacrifice, but had never quite died. Victoria Ashworth, the evening's organizer and heir to a tech fortune that had reshaped Silicon Valley, approached Marcus with the measured steps of someone accustomed to controlling every situation through the sheer force of her privilege. At 38, she embodied everything that San Francisco's new money valued: innovation, efficiency, and the unshakable conviction that her success gave her the moral authority to determine who deserved access to culture and who should be grateful for whatever scraps the wealthy chose to provide. Her evening gown, a creation from a Milan designer whose waiting list stretched for months, flowed around her like liquid silver as she moved. The diamonds at her throat caught the light with each breath, their brilliance a calculated reminder of the vast economic chasm that separated her world from that of the soot-stained firefighter who had dared to intrude upon her carefully curated evening. "Sir," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of condescending politeness that wealthy people mistake for kindness. "I believe there's been some sort of misunderstanding." This is a private fundraising event with a minimum donation requirement of $5,000 per person. She paused, allowing her gaze to travel slowly from Marcus's steel-toed boots to his ash-darkened helmet, cataloging every detail that confirmed his unsuitability for her gathering. Perhaps you're looking for the community center? I believe they serve meals to people in your situation every Tuesday and Thursday evening. Marcus felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced countless times throughout his life when his working-class background marked him as somehow lesser in the eyes of those born into privilege. But beneath that familiar sting was something else, something that had been growing stronger over the past months as he found himself increasingly drawn back to the music that had once been his greatest love and most profound loss. "I just wanted to play," Marcus repeated, his voice gaining strength despite his exhaustion. The words carried 22 years of suppressed dreams, 22 years of sacrifice that had cost him everything he had once believed possible for his life. "Just one song in exchange for a meal. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning and I saw the piano." His eyes moved past Victoria to the magnificent instrument that dominated the center of the ballroom. The Steinway Model D concert grand piano gleamed like a black jewel under the elaborate lighting, its surface so perfectly polished that it reflected the ornate ceiling above like a dark mirror. For Marcus, looking at that piano was like looking at a door to a world he had been forced to abandon, a world where his hands had once created beauty instead of merely fighting destruction. The laughter that erupted from the crowd was like the roar of flames consuming everything in their path. It started with a few snickers from the guests closest to the confrontation, then spread throughout the ballroom like wildfire through dry timber. Soon, the entire gathering was united in their amusement at this working man's audacious delusion. "Did you hear that?" laughed technology mogul James Crawford, gesturing toward Marcus with his wine glass in a way that sent droplets of burgundy onto the marble floor. "He actually thinks he can play piano. Probably saw some movie about a working-class hero and thinks life works like Hollywood." "It's almost endearing, isn't it?" added socialite Margaret Vandenberg, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "These blue-collar workers watch a YouTube video or hear a song on the radio and suddenly think they're concert pianists. They have no concept of the years of training and education required for real musical achievement." "Next, he'll be telling us he's related to Mozart," chimed in another guest, causing another wave of laughter to sweep through the crowd. But Marcus didn't flinch. Something in his bearing, in the way he held himself despite the mockery and condescension, suggested depths that none of these privileged observers could fathom. His weathered hands, scarred from years of rescue work and fire suppression, rested calmly at his sides, but his fingers moved in subtle patterns, as if playing invisible melodies on an unseen keyboard. It was a habit he had developed during the long, lonely years after his father's death, a way of keeping alive the muscle memory of a skill that had once defined his entire identity. Dr. Eleanor Chen, internationally renowned concert pianist and professor emeritus at the San Francisco Conservatory, watched the unfolding scene from her position near the piano. She had been scheduled to provide the evening's entertainment, a carefully selected program of crowd-pleasing classics designed to provide elegant background ambiance for the wealthy donor's conversations. But something about the firefighter's unwavering focus on the instrument, the reverence in his gaze, stirred her professional instincts in ways she hadn't experienced in years. In 4 decades of professional music making, Dr. Chen had developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize authentic musical souls. She could spot genuine talent from across a room, could distinguish between those who merely played notes and those who truly understood music as a living, breathing language. As she observed Marcus, something about his stillness, his complete absorption in the presence of the piano, triggered every one of her carefully honed instincts. "Victoria, Dr. Chen approached the gala organizer with the quiet authority of someone whose reputation transcended social climbing and financial maneuvering. Perhaps we should allow him to play. After all, isn't tonight supposed to celebrate the democratizing power of music? Victoria's laugh was like breaking crystal, sharp and cutting. Eleanor, really, be sensible. Look at the man. She gestured dismissively toward Marcus, as if he were an inanimate object rather than a human being standing just feet away. People like this don't have access to proper musical education. It's simply impossible. He's probably never even touched a real piano, much less learned to play one properly. What Victoria and her fellow guests couldn't possibly know was that Marcus Thompson had spent the first 18 years of his life immersed in music so deeply that it had shaped every aspect of his identity and dreams. His father, James Thompson, had been far more than just another struggling musician trying to make ends meet in the competitive Oakland jazz scene of the 1980s and 1990s. James had been a virtuoso, a pianist whose technical skills and musical understanding rivaled those of any conservatory graduate, but whose career had been limited by the economic realities of supporting a family on musicians' wages. James Thompson had grown up during the tail end of the civil rights era, a time when exceptional African-American musicians could achieve recognition within their own communities, but still faced barriers in the predominantly white world of classical music. Rather than become bitter about the opportunities denied to him, James had channeled his passion into teaching, transforming his modest Oakland apartment into an informal conservatory where neighborhood children discovered that classical music belonged to them just as much as it belonged to anyone else. "Music doesn't care about your zip code," James used to tell young Marcus during their evening practice sessions. "It doesn't care about your parents' bank account or the color of your skin or what people think about where you come from. Music only cares about the truth you bring to it, the honesty in your hands and heart." For Marcus, those words had been more than philosophy. They had been a roadmap to a future that seemed to shimmer with infinite possibility. From the age of 4, he had spent every spare moment at the upright piano that dominated their small living room. A well-worn instrument that James had rescued from a church that was upgrading to a newer model. Under his father's patient guidance, Marcus absorbed not just technique but musical understanding, learning to hear the mathematical relationships that governed harmony and the emotional logic that made great compositions timeless. By the time Marcus reached high school, his talent had become impossible to ignore. He won every local youth competition he entered, earned a spot in the Oakland Youth Symphony as their youngest member ever, and caught the attention of scouts from several prestigious conservatories. His senior recital, performed in the auditorium of a local community college because his high school lacked adequate facilities, had brought tears to the eyes of seasoned music teachers who recognized they were witnessing something truly special. The acceptance letter from the San Francisco Conservatory arrived on a Tuesday in spring, offering Marcus a partial scholarship that would cover roughly 60% of his tuition costs. The remaining expenses, while substantial, seemed manageable when weighed against the promise of a future where he could make his living as a professional musician. James had looked at that letter with tears streaming down his face, knowing that his son had achieved something that had been denied to him by circumstances beyond his control. But life, as Marcus learned with devastating swiftness, rarely unfolds according to our dreams. Just 3 weeks after receiving his acceptance letter, James Thompson suffered a massive heart attack while performing at a local club. He died before the paramedics could arrive, leaving behind a 17-year-old son, a 13-year-old daughter, and a mountain of debt that made college seem impossible for either child. Marcus faced a choice that no teenager should have to make: pursue his musical dreams at the conservatory while his younger sister Emma dropped out of school to work, or abandon his own future to ensure that she could have the education and opportunities she deserved. For Marcus, raised by a father who believed that family loyalty was the highest virtue, there was really no choice at all. He turned down the conservatory scholarship and enrolled instead in the fire academy, drawn to a profession that offered steady employment, excellent benefits, and the chance to serve his community in meaningful ways. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was choosing to spend his life fighting the kind of destructive forces that had, in a different form, destroyed his musical dreams. Emma eventually graduated valedictorian of her high school class and earned a full scholarship to UC Berkeley, where she studied to become a pediatric nurse. She often told people that her success was built on the foundation of her brother's sacrifice, a debt she knew she could never fully repay, but honored by dedicating her life to helping others just as Marcus had done for her. Through all the years that followed, through the grueling physical demands of firefighter training, through the psychological challenges of witnessing human tragedy on an almost daily basis, through the bone-deep exhaustion that came with working 24-hour shifts in one of the nation's busiest fire departments, Marcus never completely let go of music. He couldn't afford a real piano, but he kept an old electronic keyboard in his small apartment and practiced whenever his schedule allowed. Late at night, after particularly difficult shifts where he had lost someone despite his best efforts, Marcus would sit at that keyboard and play the pieces his father had taught him 20 years earlier. The music became his way of processing grief, of maintaining connection with the part of himself that had been forced into hibernation but never truly died. As the years passed, Marcus developed a reputation within the fire department as someone who could be counted on in any crisis, someone whose calm competence and natural leadership made him invaluable during the most challenging emergencies. He earned promotion to captain ahead of schedule, not through political maneuvering, but through the respect of his peers who knew that Marcus Thompson would never ask them to take risks he wouldn't take himself. But even as he excelled in his chosen profession, part of him remained forever frozen at 18 years old, standing at a crossroads where duty had triumphed over dreams, where love for his sister had required the sacrifice of everything he had once believed possible for himself. Now, standing in the marble luxury of the Metropolitan Arts Center while San Francisco's cultural elite laughed at his presumption, Marcus felt all those suppressed years of longing crystallize into a moment of perfect clarity. He had spent 2 decades proving his worth through service and sacrifice, but he had never stopped being the musician his father had trained him to become. Victoria Ashworth crossed her arms and regarded Marcus with the kind of theatrical amusement that wealthy people often display when they encounter what they perceive as entertaining delusions from the lower classes. Her smile was calculated to convey both superiority and a kind of patronizing kindness, the expression of someone who believes that humoring the fantasies of working people is a form of charity. "Very well," she announced to the gathering crowd, her voice carrying easily across the marble expanse of the ballroom. "Since our working-class friend seems so determined to entertain us, let's give him the opportunity to do exactly that." The guests pressed closer, sensing the beginning of a spectacle that would provide them with amusing anecdotes to share at future social gatherings. Victoria basked in the attention, relishing her role as the orchestrator of what she anticipated would be a brief but memorable demonstration of why social hierarchies existed for good reason. "Here are my terms," Victoria declared, raising one perfectly manicured finger adorned with a diamond that had cost more than Marcus earned in 6 months of risking his life for the city's citizens. "You may play exactly one piece of music, and we will choose what that piece should be." She paused for dramatic effect, allowing the tension to build like pressure in a sealed container approaching the point of explosion. The crowd murmured approvingly, impressed by her apparent fairness in granting this ridiculous request. "If you manage to play competently," Victoria continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone announcing the rules of a particularly amusing game, "I will personally write a check for $1,000 to ensure you can eat well for the next several weeks. It will be my contribution to charitable causes." The crowd laughed appreciatively at her wit, but Victoria wasn't finished with her conditions. "However," she said, her smile turning sharp as a blade, When you fail to play adequately, as we all know you inevitably will, you will leave this event immediately and never again disrupt gatherings of respectable citizens. You will also publicly acknowledge that working-class people should recognize their limitations and not presume to participate in cultural activities beyond their education and social station. "How cruel," whispered Dr. Chen from her position near the piano, but her voice was lost in the approving murmurs that rippled through the assembled guests. Marcus stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the magnificent Steinway as memories flooded through his consciousness like water through a burst dam. He could almost hear his father's voice echoing across 24 years of separation. "When people try to make you small, son, let the music make you tall. Let it speak the truth that they're too blind or too frightened to see." "I accept your terms," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the steady authority of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. Dr. Chen felt a chill run down her spine as she observed the firefighter's composure. In her decades of experience evaluating musical talent, she had learned to recognize the signs of authentic confidence. True musicians possessed a particular stillness before they played, a centering that came from absolute trust in their abilities. This man, despite his humble circumstances and obvious exhaustion, radiated exactly that quality. Victoria clapped her hands together with obvious delight. "Excellent! Now what should our aspiring virtuoso attempt? We want to be fair after all, so let's choose something that any competent amateur might know." She scanned the crowd with theatrical deliberation, her gaze eventually settling on Jonathan Hartwell, a mediocre pianist who taught at an expensive private academy and whose primary qualification was his family's old money rather than any particular musical gift. "Jonathan, darling," Victoria called out, "what would be an appropriate piece for our firefighter friend? Something challenging enough to be interesting but not so difficult that we could be accused of unfairness." Jonathan Hartwell stepped forward with the self-important air of someone who had spent his entire life confusing privilege with expertise. At 45, he had never achieved anything resembling musical distinction, but his teaching position at the elite Pemberton Academy gave him access to San Francisco's wealthiest families and the social status that came with educating their children. "How about Chopin's Minute Waltz?" Jonathan suggested with malicious glee. "It's famous enough that any amateur who's ever sat at a piano thinks they can play it, but complex enough to expose a lack of proper training immediately." The suggestion drew knowing chuckles from the crowd. Chopin's Waltz in D-flat major, Op. 64, No. 1, commonly known as the Minute Waltz, was indeed a perfect trap. Its playful, accessible melody made it seem deceptively simple to untrained ears, but executing it properly required not only advanced technical skills, but also the kind of musical sophistication that took years to develop. The piece demanded rapid fingerwork, precise coordination between the hands, and subtle control of dynamics and phrasing that could only come from extensive classical training. It was exactly the kind of selection that would allow a pretender to attempt the opening measures before failing spectacularly, providing maximum entertainment for the cruel audience. "Perfect choice," Victoria applauded. "A piece that anyone with genuine musical knowledge should be able to manage. No excuses for failure." Marcus nodded once and began walking toward the piano with measured steps that seemed to carry the weight of every fire he had fought, every life he had saved, and every dream he had been forced to abandon. There was something in his bearing that made several people in the back of the room feel inexplicably uncomfortable, a dignity that seemed incongruous with the public humiliation they were about to witness. As Marcus approached the magnificent Steinway, he set his firefighter helmet carefully on the floor beside the bench and flexed his fingers with the unconscious efficiency of someone whose muscle memory ran deeper than conscious thought. These hands had pulled unconscious children from smoke-filled apartments, had performed CPR on victims of cardiac arrest, had wielded axes and chainsaws in battles against forces that could kill lesser men. Now they would speak in a different language, one that transcended the prejudices and assumptions of everyone in that opulent room. Dr. Chen moved closer to the piano, her professional curiosity overriding social protocol. She noticed immediately how Marcus adjusted the bench height with precise automatic movements that spoke of countless hours of practice. These weren't the fumbling adjustments of a novice, but the efficient setup routine of someone for whom proper piano technique was as natural as breathing. "Look at that," Victoria sneered to the guests nearest her. "He doesn't even know how to sit properly. This will be over before he plays 10 notes. But Dr. Chen saw exactly the opposite. Marcus's posture was textbook perfect. Straight back, relaxed shoulders, arms positioned at optimal angles for both power and delicacy. His wrists were held at the precise height that allowed for maximum finger independence, and his feet were positioned correctly on the pedals despite the fact that he hadn't yet touched them. These details represented years of disciplined training and could never be faked by someone without extensive classical education. As Marcus placed his hands above the keyboard in the classic preparatory position, the ballroom fell into expectant silence. The guests leaned forward slightly, eager to witness what they anticipated would be a brief but amusing confirmation of their assumptions about class, education, and natural ability. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, and in that silence, he could hear his father's voice as clearly as if James Thompson were standing beside him. "Every piece of music tells a story, son. Chopin's waltzes aren't just dance music, they're poetry in motion, dreams given wings. When you play Chopin, you're not just moving your fingers. You're speaking the language of longing and joy and perfect moments that exist only in music." The first notes of the Minute Waltz emerged from the Steinway with crystalline clarity that made several guests stop their quiet conversations mid-sentence. This wasn't the hesitant, amateurish sound they had expected to hear, but notes played with the confidence and precision that could only come from serious musical training. Dr. Chen felt her pulse quicken as Marcus navigated the opening measures with flawless technique. The famous melody, with its playful ascending figures and graceful descents, flowed from his hands like water, finding its natural course. Every note was perfectly articulated, every phrase shaped with the kind of musical intelligence that took decades to develop. "Just beginner's luck," Victoria murmured to herself. But her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence as Marcus continued into the waltz's more challenging passages without the slightest hesitation. As the piece progressed, it became impossible to deny that something extraordinary was taking place. Marcus's interpretation wasn't just technically accurate, it was musically mature in ways that left Dr. Chen completely stunned. The way he controlled the dynamics, building and releasing tension with each phrase, the subtle rubato that gave the music breathing space without disrupting its essential pulse, the perfect balance between the melody and the accompanying harmonies. These were the hallmarks of a seasoned artist, not an untrained amateur. The ballroom had fallen completely silent now, champagne glasses suspended halfway to lips, conversations abandoned mid-word. Even the serving staff had stopped their movements, mesmerized by the unexpected beauty flowing from this soot-stained firefighter who had been dismissed as a delusional vagrant just minutes earlier. But there was something even more remarkable than technical excellence in Marcus's playing. There was emotional depth, a quality of lived experience that gave weight and meaning to every note. He wasn't simply executing Chopin's composition, he was telling his own story through the Polish master's musical language, using the waltz's elegant structures to express 24 years of sacrifice, loss, and dreams deferred but never abandoned. Dr. Chen watched in amazement as Marcus approached the piece's most technically demanding sections. The rapid passages that challenged even advanced conservatory students flowed from his fingers like liquid silver, each note perfectly placed and weighted. The complex polyrhythms that required absolute independence between the hands were executed with an ease that spoke of countless hours of disciplined practice. Victoria felt a growing unease in her stomach as she realized that her carefully orchestrated humiliation was transforming into something entirely different, something beyond her control. The firefighters' playing wasn't just competent, it was genuinely beautiful, more musically sophisticated than anything she had heard from Jonathan Hartwell despite his expensive credentials and academy position. As Marcus reached the climactic section of the waltz, where Chopin's melody soars above increasingly complex harmonies, he demonstrated the kind of interpretive maturity that separated true artists from mere technicians. Instead of simply playing the notes as written, he found within them a story of triumph over adversity, of beauty emerging from struggle, of dreams that refused to die despite every attempt to bury them. The audience watched in stunned silence as this humble public servant, this man they had mocked and dismissed, revealed depths of artistry that challenged every assumption they held about talent, class, and human worth. His hands, roughened by years of dangerous rescue work, produced sounds of such ethereal beauty that several people felt tears unexpectedly welling in their eyes. Dr. Chen found herself completely captivated by what she was witnessing. In 40 years of professional music making, she had rarely encountered such a combination of flawless technique and genuine musical soul, especially under such hostile circumstances and tremendous pressure. As Marcus guided the minute waltz toward its famous conclusion, he demonstrated the kind of musical wisdom that typically took a lifetime to acquire. The final section, with its playful return to the opening theme and its brilliant technical flourishes, was executed with a joy and confidence that made the music seem to dance in the air above the piano. The last notes hung in the ballroom's perfect acoustics like incense slowly dissipating, each harmonic gradually fading until only silence remained. Marcus kept his hands suspended above the keys for a moment, reluctant to break the magical connection between himself and the instrument that had been his first love and greatest sacrifice. When he finally turned on the bench to face the silent crowd, there was no trace of the exhausted working man who had begged for food just minutes earlier. In his place sat an artist who had just reclaimed his birthright through the universal language of music, someone who had proven that excellence could emerge from the most unexpected places when given the chance to flourish. Dr. Chen was the first to break the silence, her hands coming together in respectful applause that echoed through the marble hall like thunder rolling across San Francisco Bay. Gradually, hesitantly, others joined in, until the Metropolitan Arts Center resonated with genuine acclaim that had nothing to do with social obligation and everything to do with recognition of extraordinary talent. But not everyone was prepared to abandon their prejudices so easily. Victoria Ashworth stood frozen in place, her face pale as she grappled with the implications of what she had just witnessed. Her carefully constructed world-view, built on assumptions about class and merit that had never been seriously challenged, was crumbling before her eyes. "That was unexpected," she managed to say, her voice barely audible above the continuing applause. Jonathan Hartwell, whose mediocre talents had been completely overshadowed by Marcus's performance, felt compelled to maintain the narrative that protected his own position. "He must have memorized that piece from a recording," he declared loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Rote memorization isn't the same as real musical understanding." But Dr. Chen, who had observed every detail of Marcus's performance with professional expertise, turned to face Hartwell with undisguised contempt. "Jonathan, in 30 years of evaluating pianists, I've never heard a more musically intelligent interpretation of that piece. What this man just demonstrated goes far beyond memorization. It requires the kind of deep understanding that only comes from years of serious study and genuine talent. Marcus remained seated at the piano, allowing the applause to wash over him like cool water after fighting a particularly brutal fire. But behind his composed exterior, something was crystallizing that went far beyond personal vindication. This moment represented an opportunity to challenge the very foundations of the cultural gatekeeping that kept working people like himself excluded from the arts they helped fund through their tax dollars. "Sir," Dr. Chen approached him with deep respect, "I must ask where you studied. Your technique is absolutely extraordinary, and your musical interpretation shows remarkable maturity." Marcus looked directly into her eyes, and for a moment he allowed all the sacrifice and loss of the past 24 years to show in his expression. "My father taught me," he replied simply. "James Thompson. He said that music belongs to everyone who truly loves it, regardless of their circumstances or social status." The name struck Dr. Chen like lightning. Her eyes widened as memories from decades past suddenly clicked into place. James Thompson, the jazz pianist from Oakland, the one who should have been playing with the major symphony orchestras but never got the chance? Marcus nodded, surprised that anyone in this rarefied atmosphere would remember his father. "You knew him?" "I knew of him," Dr. Chen said reverently. "He was a legend in the Bay Area music community. Every serious musician knew that James Thompson was one of the most gifted pianists in the region. It was a tragedy that the classical music world never gave him the recognition he deserved." Victoria watched this exchange with mounting horror as she realized that the narrative was spiraling completely out of her control. Instead of exposing a delusional working man, she had inadvertently provided a platform for someone whose musical pedigree was becoming more impressive with each revelation. "This is all very touching," Victoria interrupted, her voice sharp with desperation. "But it doesn't change the fact that he disrupted a private event and has no business being here among respectable people." Marcus stood from the piano bench, rising to his full height of 6 feet 2 inches. The physical presence that made him so effective as a firefighter now filled the ballroom with an authority that had nothing to do with social status and everything to do with inherent dignity and moral strength. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying the calm command that came from 2 decades of leading men and women into life-threatening situations. "You're absolutely right. I shouldn't be here tonight." He paused, allowing the silence to settle over the room like smoke before a major fire reveal. Victoria felt a glimmer of satisfaction, thinking that the firefighter was finally acknowledging his proper place. "I should be at Davies Symphony Hall," Marcus continued, "where I'm scheduled to perform next month as featured soloist with the San Francisco Symphony in their annual benefit concert for first responder families." The gasp that rippled through the crowd was audible. Victoria felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet as she struggled to process this latest revelation. "My name is Captain Marcus Thompson," he continued, his voice steady and clear. "And while I am indeed a firefighter, I'm also a classical pianist who has been performing benefit concerts throughout Northern California for the past 8 years. I completed my musical education through night classes at the San Francisco Conservatory while serving this city, and I hold both a Bachelor of Music degree and a Master's in Piano Performance." Dr. Chen's mouth fell open as the pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place in her mind. "The Heroes and Harmonies concert series," she breathed. "That's you?" Marcus nodded. "For 8 years, I've been organizing monthly concerts featuring first responders who are also professional-level musicians. We've raised over $3 million for families of fallen firefighters, police officers, and paramedics, while also providing music education programs in working-class communities throughout the Bay Area." The revelation fell on the room like a controlled demolition, reducing Victoria's carefully constructed evening to rubble. Her face drained of color as she realized the magnitude of her mistake and the implications for her social standing. "You see," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength with each word, "I didn't come here tonight because I needed food or charity. I came because I wanted to understand exactly how the city's cultural elite really feels about working-class people who dare to participate in the arts they claim to champion." Jonathan Hartwell, sensing disaster approaching, tried to interrupt. "Now see here, this is all very convenient. But how do we know any of this is true? Anyone can make claims." Dr. Chen silenced him with a look that could have frozen the San Francisco Bay. "Because I've attended 3 of Captain Thompson's concerts, Jonathan. I've watched him raise hundreds of thousands of dollars while performing at a level that puts most conservatory graduates to shame." She turned back to Marcus with growing understanding. "You were documenting us tonight, weren't you?" "In a way," Marcus confirmed, gesturing toward his firefighter helmet. Several people now noticed for the first time that it had a small recording device attached to the crown. "I've been invited to deliver the keynote address at next week's National Conference on Arts Accessibility. I wanted to have concrete examples of how class prejudice operates in supposedly progressive cultural institutions." The crowd began to stir as panic spread through the ballroom like wildfire through dry timber. People frantically began trying to remember exactly what they had said and done over the past hour, realizing that their casual cruelty had been captured for posterity. The conference will be attended by over 2,000 arts educators, foundation directors, and cultural policymakers from across the country, Marcus explained. "My presentation will focus on the barriers that working people face when they try to engage with institutions that claim to serve the public while actually serving only the wealthy." Victoria found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You can't use recordings of private conversations without consent. That's illegal." "Actually, Dr." Chen interjected, her voice carrying a note of dark satisfaction. "The invitation clearly stated that this event might be documented for educational and promotional purposes. Everyone signed media releases when they checked in tonight." Marcus smiled, the first genuine expression of joy he had shown all evening. The beautiful thing about music is that it reveals truth in ways that words cannot. "When I played just now, you heard something that transcended all your assumptions about firefighters and working people. For just a few minutes, you forgot about social class and economic status and simply listened to music." He picked up his helmet and faced Victoria directly. "You spent this evening trying to prove that people like me don't belong in spaces like this, that we lack the education and refinement necessary to appreciate high culture. Tomorrow, when this footage is seen by thousands of arts professionals at the national conference, they'll witness exactly the kind of gatekeeping that keeps talented people away from the arts." Victoria tried to speak, but no words came. The implications of her behavior being broadcast to a national audience of cultural professionals was simply too devastating to process. Her reputation, her social standing, her entire identity was built on being perceived as a patron of the arts and champion of educational access. "The difference between you and me, Miss Ashworth," Marcus said quietly, "is that when I'm fighting fires in working-class neighborhoods, I never ask people what they do for a living or how much money they make before I risk my life to save them. Human worth isn't determined by your bank balance or your zip code." Dr. Chen approached Marcus with profound respect. "Captain Thompson, would you consider giving a master class for our conservatory students? They need to understand that musical excellence can emerge from any background and that true artistry often comes from life experience rather than just technical training." "I'd be honored," Marcus replied. "I've been teaching community music classes for years, and some of my most talented students come from backgrounds that traditional institutions completely overlook." As Marcus prepared to leave the ballroom, securing the recording device in his helmet and gathering his composure after what had been an emotionally exhausting evening, one final question hung in the air like smoke after a fire. How many other working people had been dismissed and underestimated by those who claimed to champion the very values they actually worked to restrict? But the evening wasn't quite over. As Marcus turned toward the exit, Dr. Chen called out to him with sudden urgency. "Captain Thompson, please wait. There's something else I need to ask you." Marcus paused, sensing that whatever Dr. Chen wanted to discuss would be important. The renowned pianist approached him with an expression that mixed professional excitement with something deeper, something that looked almost like hope. "I've been struggling with a problem for months," she began, her voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. "The conservatory has been trying to develop meaningful outreach programs, but we keep running into the same obstacle. We can't seem to bridge the gap between our institution and the communities we're supposed to serve." She paused, glancing around at the wealthy guests who were still processing what they had witnessed. "Tonight, watching you play, seeing how you connected with that music despite everything these people put you through, I realized what we've been missing. We've been trying to bring classical music to working-class communities without understanding that classical music already exists in those communities. We just haven't been listening." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she meant. "It's like fighting fires," he said. "You can't save a building by standing outside and spraying water at it. You have to go inside, understand the structure, find where the real problems are." "Exactly," Dr. Chen said, her excitement growing. "Would you consider partnering with us? Not as a charity case or token representative, but as a true collaborator? We need someone who understands both worlds, someone who can help us build real bridges instead of just throwing money at the problem." Before Marcus could respond, Victoria Ashworth stepped forward, her face flushed with what might have been desperation or sudden inspiration. "Now wait just a minute," she said, her voice carrying a different tone than it had all evening. "If we're talking about community partnerships and outreach programs, the Metropolitan Arts Foundation should be part of this discussion." The transformation in Victoria's demeanor was so sudden and complete that several guests exchanged glances of confusion. The woman who had spent the entire evening demonstrating casual cruelty toward Marcus was now speaking as if they were potential collaborators. "I mean," Victoria continued, her words coming faster as she seemed to realize that her social survival might depend on quickly repositioning herself. "Tonight has been a real eye-opener for all of us. We've all learned valuable lessons about assumptions and the importance of not judging people by appearances." Dr. Chen looked at Victoria with barely concealed disgust. "Victoria, an hour ago you were trying to humiliate this man for sport. Now you want to be his partner?" "People can change," Victoria insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "Tonight has shown me that perhaps we've been too exclusive in our approach to cultural programming." Marcus studied Victoria carefully, his 22 years of reading people in crisis situations telling him everything he needed to know about her motivations. This wasn't genuine transformation, this was damage control. She had realized that being on the wrong side of this story could destroy her social position and was frantically trying to rewrite the narrative. "Miss Ashworth," Marcus said calmly, "I appreciate your sudden interest in collaboration, but real partnerships are built on mutual respect and shared values, not on fear of public embarrassment." Victoria's face reddened, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "If I may interrupt," said a man who had been standing quietly near the back of the crowd. He was perhaps 60 years old, dressed in an expensive but understated suit, with the kind of bearing that suggested both wealth and actual substance. "I'm Robert Morrison," the man said, approaching Marcus with extended hand. "Morrison Foundation. We fund arts education programs throughout California." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the man's firm grip and direct gaze. Unlike most of the other guests, Morrison seemed genuinely calm and thoughtful rather than panicked or calculating. "Captain Thompson, I've been watching tonight's events with great interest," Morrison continued. "Not just your remarkable performance, but the entire social dynamic that led up to it. What I witnessed here confirms something I've suspected for years about the way we approach arts philanthropy." He paused, looking around at the assembled crowd before continuing. "We've been funding the wrong things. We throw money at institutions and pat ourselves on the back for supporting the arts, but we never actually examine whether we're creating access or just reinforcing barriers." Dr. Chen nodded emphatically. "That's exactly what I was trying to explain. We need to completely rethink our approach." "Which is why," Morrison said, turning back to Marcus, "I'd like to propose something different. Instead of trying to fit community outreach into existing institutional frameworks, what if we created something entirely new? A program that truly represents working-class musicians and serves working-class communities?" Marcus felt a spark of interest, but his natural caution made him probe deeper. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Morrison?" "Full funding for a comprehensive music education initiative," Morrison replied without hesitation. "Not a charity program run by wealthy volunteers, but a professional operation staffed and led by musicians who actually come from the communities being served. You would have complete artistic and administrative control." The offer was substantial enough to make several guests gasp audibly. Morrison continued, "The Morrison Foundation is prepared to commit $2 million annually for the first 5 years, with renewal based on results rather than politics." Victoria stepped forward again, clearly unwilling to be completely sidelined. "The Metropolitan Arts Foundation would want to be involved as well," she said quickly. "We have extensive experience in fundraising and event organization." Morrison looked at her with the kind of polite dismissal that old money reserves for new money's social climbing. "I think Captain Thompson can handle his own fundraising, Victoria. Tonight has demonstrated his ability to reveal people's true characters quite effectively." The subtle insult hit its mark, and Victoria stepped back as if she had been slapped. She was beginning to realize that her behavior tonight might have consequences far beyond simple embarrassment. Marcus found himself in the surreal position of being courted by the same people who had ridiculed him just hours earlier, but he had learned to be cautious of sudden reversals of fortune. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate the offer, but I need to understand what you're really looking for here." "Honesty," Morrison replied immediately. "Tonight, you've shown everyone in this room what authentic excellence looks like, and you've done it while maintaining your dignity despite facing the kind of treatment that would have broken lesser people." He gestured toward the crowd of wealthy guests, many of whom were still whispering among themselves about the evening's revelations. "These people represent everything that's wrong with how we approach cultural philanthropy. They want to be seen as patrons of the arts, but they don't actually believe that working-class people deserve access to high culture." Dr. Chen added, "What we need is someone who can create genuine programs, not photo opportunities for wealthy donors." Marcus considered the offer carefully. The resources Morrison was describing could transform music education throughout Northern California, providing opportunities for thousands of talented young people who would otherwise never have access to professional-level instruction. But he had also learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true, especially when they came from people who moved in the same social circles as those who had spent the evening mocking him. "I'm interested," Marcus said finally, "but I have conditions." "Name them," Morrison replied immediately. "First, complete autonomy over programming and hiring decisions. No interference from foundation board members who think they know better than working musicians." "Agreed." "Second, all programs must be free to participants and located in the communities we're serving, not in downtown institutions that require transportation and feel intimidating to working-class families." "Absolutely." "Third, hiring preference goes to musicians who actually come from working-class backgrounds, not conservatory graduates looking for resume padding." Morrison smiled. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." As the terms of this unexpected partnership began to take shape, Victoria Ashworth found herself increasingly marginalized in a conversation that might determine the future of arts funding in the Bay Area. Her attempts to insert herself into the discussion were politely but firmly deflected, and she began to realize that her behavior tonight had consequences that extended far beyond social embarrassment. Dr. Chen, meanwhile, was experiencing something approaching euphoria as she realized that Marcus's emergence might finally provide the catalyst needed to transform how major cultural institutions approached community engagement. For years, she had watched the conservatory's outreach efforts fail because they were designed by people who had never experienced economic hardship and delivered by people who had no authentic connection to the communities they claimed to serve. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Everything that happened here tonight, all the recordings I made, they're still going to be part of my presentation at the national conference." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Good. The arts community needs to confront its own prejudices honestly if we're going to create real change." Victoria finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Captain Thompson, surely we can discuss... perhaps there's a way to frame tonight's events that would be more constructive." Marcus looked at her with the kind of steady gaze he reserved for people who were trying to negotiate their way out of the consequences of their own actions. "Miss Ashworth, the most constructive thing that could come from tonight would be for people to see exactly how cultural gatekeeping works in practice." He paused, allowing the full weight of his words to settle. "When working people see this footage, they'll understand that the barriers they encounter aren't accidental. When arts professionals see it, maybe some of them will finally understand why their outreach programs keep failing." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Morrison and Dr. Chen working out preliminary details of what would become the Bay Area Community Music Initiative. By the time Marcus finally left the Metropolitan Arts Center, he had commitments for funding, performance venues, and institutional partnerships that would allow him to create exactly the kind of program he had dreamed about for years. But more importantly, he had proven something to himself that he had wondered about for 2 decades. The musical abilities that had been forced into hibernation by economic necessity hadn't atrophied during his years as a firefighter. If anything, his life experience had given his playing an emotional depth and authenticity that no amount of privileged education could provide. As Marcus walked through the cool San Francisco night toward his car, still wearing his soot-stained uniform and carrying his dented helmet, he allowed himself to imagine what might be possible now that he had reclaimed his identity as both a public servant and a musician. The recording device in his helmet contained not just evidence of cultural elitism, but documentation of the moment when his 2 worlds finally converged into something larger than either could have been alone. 6 months later, the transformation that began that evening at the Metropolitan Arts Center had rippled outward in ways that none of the participants could have predicted. The Bay Area Community Music Initiative had become a model for similar programs across the country, with Marcus Thompson serving as both its director and its most visible advocate for music education accessibility. Victoria Ashworth's fall from social grace had been swift and decisive. The footage from that evening, when shown at the National Conference on Arts Accessibility, had indeed gone viral within hours. Major news outlets picked up the story, and Victoria became a national symbol of cultural elitism and class prejudice that resonated far beyond the arts community. San Francisco elite exposed, firefighter pianist reveals, true face of cultural gatekeeping, read headlines from coast to coast. The story struck a chord with working people who had always suspected that the cultural institutions they supported through their tax dollars didn't actually want their participation. Victoria lost her position as director of several major cultural organizations and found herself effectively blacklisted from the San Francisco philanthropic community. The very people who had laughed along with her cruelty distanced themselves with the speed and ruthlessness that only the truly privileged can muster when protecting their own reputations. She eventually took a position with a small arts nonprofit in Sacramento, working for a fraction of her former salary and learning, perhaps for the first time in her life, what it meant to justify every dollar spent and every program implemented. The experience was humbling in ways that her privileged upbringing had never prepared her for. Dr. Chen, meanwhile, had become Marcus's closest professional collaborator, helping him navigate the complex world of arts administration while learning from him about authentic community engagement. Together, they developed innovative programs that brought professional-level music education directly into fire stations, police departments, and blue-collar communities throughout Northern California. The Heroes and Harmonies concert series evolved into something much larger than Marcus had originally envisioned. What had started as monthly fundraisers for first responder families became a national movement that challenged stereotypes about working-class people and demonstrated that exceptional talent could emerge from any background. Marcus's performances continued to sell out venues throughout California and beyond, not just because of his considerable musical abilities, but because audiences connected with his story of sacrifice, service, and the refusal to let circumstances define limitations. His concerts raised over $5 million in his first year as a nationally recognized artist, supporting hundreds of families and creating music programs in communities that had never had access to professional instruction. The Metropolitan Arts Center, embarrassed by the public exposure of the attitudes that had been displayed at their gala, underwent a complete reorganization of their community engagement programs. They established the Marcus Thompson Fellowship, providing full scholarships and professional quality instruments to talented students from working-class families throughout the Bay Area. But perhaps the most significant change was in the conversation itself. Marcus's story had opened up a national dialogue about class, culture, and who gets to participate in the arts. Fire departments across the country reported increased applications from candidates with diverse backgrounds and talents, as the stereotype of the one-dimensional first responder began to crumble. Stories emerged of paramedics who were published poets, police officers who were trained dancers, teachers who were accomplished musicians, and construction workers who were gifted artists. Marcus had become a symbol of something larger than individual achievement. He represented the hidden talents and suppressed dreams of working people everywhere. Robert Morrison's foundation continued to fund the Community Music Initiative, but their approach to philanthropy had been fundamentally altered by the events of that evening. Instead of simply writing checks to established institutions, they began seeking out programs that were actually created and led by people from the communities being served. Marcus himself continued working as a fire captain, refusing several offers to leave the department for full-time musical careers. "Music makes me a better firefighter," he explained in interviews, "and firefighting makes me a better musician. Both require you to stay calm under pressure. Both require you to work as part of a team, and both are about service to other people." His monthly performances at Davies Symphony Hall became cultural events that attracted audiences far beyond the traditional classical music demographic. Working people who had never set foot in a symphony hall came to hear one of their own perform at the highest level, while traditional classical music audiences discovered that excellence could emerge from backgrounds they had never considered. The recording of that evening at the Metropolitan Arts Center became required viewing in arts administration programs across the country, used as a case study in how class prejudice operates in cultural institutions and how authentic community engagement requires fundamental changes in attitude rather than just increased funding. Victoria Ashworth, watching one of Marcus's performances from the back of a small concert hall in Sacramento where she now worked, finally understood the lesson that had cost her everything she had once valued. Excellence wasn't the property of any particular class or background. It emerged from dedication, sacrifice, and the courage to pursue your gifts regardless of the obstacles placed in your path. As Marcus performed that evening, his hands moving across the keys with the same confident precision that had shocked the Metropolitan Arts Center Gala, Victoria realized that his greatest achievement wasn't in proving his musical abilities. It was in demonstrating that when society's gatekeepers are exposed to the light of truth, authentic talent will always find a way to overcome the artificial barriers that small minds try to construct. The firefighter who had been mocked for his audacity had become a symbol of something essential about American possibility: that heroism comes in many forms, that excellence recognizes no class boundaries, and that sometimes the greatest courage is simply refusing to accept that your dreams are too big for your circumstances. In the end, Marcus Thompson's story resonated because it spoke to the suppressed dreams of millions of working people who had been told, in countless subtle and not-so-subtle ways, that certain aspirations weren't meant for people like them. His success wasn't just personal vindication. It was proof that talent, dedication, and human worth couldn't be contained by the artificial boundaries that privilege tries to maintain. The boy who had learned piano in a cramped Oakland apartment had become a man who used his gifts to serve others in multiple ways, never forgetting that excellence is not about exclusion, but about lifting others up, creating opportunities where none existed before, and proving that the human capacity for beauty and achievement knows no limits when given the chance to flourish.